February 2nd, 1943, 10:18 a.m. The Bismarck Sea, somewhere north of the Papuan Peninsula. The air is thick, humid, heavy with the smell of spent high-octane fuel and salt. Staff Sergeant Nathan James is waist-deep in the warm, indifferent Pacific, his fingers locked in a death grip on the twisted aluminum skeleton of his dying bird, the B-17F Flying Fortress known as Kansas Kate. Oil burns in rainbow slicks around him, the flames cast in a terrible, dancing glare on the faces of his crew. 6 men are in the water with him, clinging to shattered wing spars, a floating ammunition crate, the bloated carcass of a life raft that never had a chance to inflate. They're coughing up salt water and aviation fuel, their sheepskin-lined flight jackets now leaden anchors, their eyes wide with a shock so profound it looks like vacancy. 20 minutes ago, they were kings of the sky, part of a stacked formation of 13 fortresses, a mailed fist aimed at the heart of a Japanese convoy, 6 transports, 4 destroyers trying to reinforce Leh. They flew through a sky polka-dotted with black flak bursts, the plane shuddering with each concussive whoomp. Then the Zeros found him. Not the clumsy Navy types they'd heard about, but the new, agile A6M3 Hamps, climbing like angry angels through their own anti-aircraft fire. They came in from the sun, their 20mm cannons sparkling. The first pass killed the radio operator, Tinker, a kid from Toledo who loved big bands. Nathan saw him simply come apart in his chair. Then the number 2 engine was hit, a stream of fire licking back along the wing, melting the skin like wax. The pilot, Captain Miller, his voice eerily calm on the intercom, gave the order. "She's going. Bail out now." Chaos in the cabin. Nathan, the flight engineer and top turret gunner, had his hands full. The ball turret gunner, Peavy, was wounded, a shard of plexiglass in his thigh. Nathan hauled him out of his plexiglass bubble, muscled him to the forward hatch against the shrieking wind. He didn't think. He shoved Peavy out into the void, followed him, tumbling into the roar, the plane a dying dragon above him. He pulled the ripcord, the canopy blossomed with a savage jerk, and the world went quiet, save for the fading drone of engines and the distant crackle of gunfire. He had a last glimpse of Kansas Kate, a winged crucifix of black smoke spiraling down toward the endless blue. Then he hit the water, the warm embrace of the sea, so different from the icy Kansas lakes of his boyhood. Now, here they were. The bomber was gone. Only the tail section, the proud painted pin-up of a farmer's daughter winking suggestively, still visible for a moment before it slid beneath with a final grieving sigh. 7 men in a vast, uncaring ocean, 100 miles from the New Guinea coast, 1,000 from anything friendly. The first thing they noticed was the silence, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the slap of waves. Then came the sharks, dark, triangular fins cutting silent, ominous circles just beyond the edge of the burning oil. No one screamed. They just watched, a primal fear locking their throats. Then the sea itself seemed to rupture. The Japanese submarine, the I-17, surfaced with a great rolling exhalation of air and water. It was a long, black, predatory shape, water cascading from its deck plates, the red disk of the rising sun on the side of its conning tower. It was a coincidence, a monstrous twist of fate. The sub had been lurking, observing the air battle, and now found easy pickings. A hatch clanged open with a sound like a gunshot. Sailors poured onto the deck, dressed in dark blue uniforms and white caps. They were armed with Arisaka rifles and Nambu pistols. They lined the railing, weapons pointed at the 7 Americans treading water. An officer emerged from the conning tower. He was young, clean-shaven, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-frame glasses. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand, which he slowly lowered.
He surveyed the scene, the wreckage, the burning oil, the helpless airmen. He barked a short, sharp order in Japanese. A sailor uncoiled a heavy rope ladder and threw it over the side, the end splashing into the water not 10 feet from Nathan James. Another sailor threw a line with a life ring attached. The meaning was unambiguous. Grab hold, be retrieved, become prisoners. Nathan James knew. He knew in the marrow of his bones. He'd heard the stories passed in low tones in the mud of Port Moresby, in the fetid air of the mess tents. The Bataan Death March was just a year old, its horrors still fresh. Prisoners used for bayonet practice, beheadings, starvation as policy. The Japanese military code, Bushido, held surrender as a stain that erased one's humanity. To them, a man who surrendered was not a man. He was mono, a thing to be worked to death, beaten on a whim, or disposed of for convenience. He looked at his crew, Peavy, pale and clutching his bleeding leg. The navigator, Lieutenant Colley, his arm bent at a sickening angle, his face a mask of pain. The tail gunner, Smitty, a kid of 19, just staring at the sub with blank terror. He thought of his own wife, Eleanor, her last letter now a pulpy, unreadable mass in his pocket, where she'd written about planting tulip bulbs behind their little house in Wichita. He thought of the 6 lives bobbing in the water, looking to him, the senior NCO, for a cue, for a decision. And Nathan James, who had grown up on a flat, landlocked farm where the biggest body of water was a stock pond, who'd never seen an ocean before his troop ship crossed the Pacific, made his decision. It was not a decision born of courage, but of a deeper, colder instinct, the refusal to become a thing. He let go of the piece of wreckage he'd clung to. He did not reach for the life ring. Instead, with a slow, deliberate stroke, he began to swim. Not toward the submarine, but parallel to it, away from his men, toward the empty, shimmering horizon. The Japanese officer shouted, his voice carrying sharply across the water. The words were gibberish to Nathan, but the tone was clear, an order to stop. A rifle cracked. A bullet hissed into the water a yard to his left, sending up a tiny geyser. Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't look back. He just kept swimming, a slow, mechanical crawl, each stroke a monumental effort in the waterlogged jacket and boots. The physical act became his entire world. Reach, pull, breathe.
From behind him he heard Colley's voice, weak and confused. "Sarge? Nathan, for God's sake, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just swam. The sub's diesel engines throbbed in the water, a sound he felt in his teeth. For 10 long seconds there was only that sound, the slap of his own arms, the burning in his lungs. Then a new sound cut through it. Laughter. It started with a single chuckle from the deck, then another. It rolled across the water, growing in volume, becoming a chorus of open, derisive mirth. The Japanese sailors were pointing, their rifles drooping, their faces split with incredulous grins. This American, this fool, was trying to swim away from a submarine in the middle of the Bismarck Sea. It was the most absurd, most pitiful thing they had ever witnessed. It was comedy in the midst of war's tragedy. The officer himself shook his head, a smile touching his lips. He barked another order, not of anger, but of amused command. The laughter swelled. It was the sound of men watching a mouse try to outrun a cat, a spectacle of such pure, hopeless folly that it transcended hostility and became pure entertainment. Nathan James heard that laughter. It did not humiliate him. It did not frighten him further. It ignited something in his chest, a cold, focused fury that burned away the shock and the fear. They were laughing at him, laughing at his certain, slow, drowning death. They were spectators to his extinction. That laughter bought him precisely 12 seconds. 12 seconds where they were an audience, not a firing squad. 12 seconds where he was a clown, not a combatant. He used those seconds.
Still swimming, he fumbled with the stiff brass buckles of his Mae West life vest. His fingers, numb and slick with oil, felt like sausages. Beneath the vest was his survival belt, and in a small waxed leather pouch sewn into the belt, meant for fishing hooks and water purification tablets, was his .45 caliber M1911 pistol. It was regulation for flight crew, a last-ditch tool for survival if they made it to a hostile shore. He had checked it that morning, as he did every morning, a full 7-round magazine, one in the chamber. Hope, heavy and metallic and cold, filled his hand. He stopped swimming, rolled onto his back, as if finally exhausted, letting the inflated bladders of the Mae West keep him afloat. He held the pistol tight against his sternum, hidden from the sub's deck by his own body and the angle. The laughter peaked, a wave of foreign sound crashing over him. He brought the pistol up. The first shot was a shocking, flat crack that seemed tiny against the immensity of sea and sky. It struck the laughing officer in the hollow of his throat. His hands flew up, not to his neck, but as if in surprise, his binoculars swinging on their strap before he crumpled forward onto the deck railing, then slid to the deck plates. The laughter died as if severed by a blade. Stunned silence for a heartbeat. Then shouts of confusion, of alarm. Nathan was already moving, shifting aim. He was a crack shot, had won the squadron's pistol competition 3 months running. The range was less than 30 yards. He fired again. A sailor, bringing his rifle to his shoulder, spun and dropped. He fired a third time. A man beside him clutched his chest and stumbled back against the conning tower. Panic, pure and undisciplined, erupted on the deck. These were not Marines. They were submariners, engine room technicians, radio men, cooks. They were expecting to pluck helpless prisoners from the sea, not engage in a gunfight with a ghost who rose from the water shooting. Their orderly line fractured. Men ducked behind the railing, fired wild, unaimed shots that zipped into the water around Nathan. He emptied the magazine. 7 shots. 4 men down on the deck, including the officer. He let the smoking pistol slip from his fingers, watched it spiral down into the blue gloom. Then he took a huge breath and dove, kicking deep beneath the oily, burning surface. Bullets stitched the water above him, trailing white lines of bubbles. He swam, lungs screaming, back toward the wreckage where his men still clung, paralyzed by the unbelievable scene. He surfaced, gasping behind a floating piece of the wing. His crew stared at him as if he were a sea monster. "The sub!" he rasped, the salt water burning his throat. "Now! Swim for the sub!" They just gawked. Peavy's mouth hung open. "They're confused. They've gone below, or they're hiding. The deck's empty. It's our only chance. That or the sharks get us by sunset." It was a madness to match his first swim, but it was a directed madness, a spark thrown into tinder. Colley, the officer, nodded once, a grim understanding in his eyes. "You heard the sergeant. Move! Help Peavy!" They moved. The wounded were supported. They began to paddle, a pathetic, desperate flotilla, not away from the enemy, but toward its steel hull. On the sub, the remaining sailors, believing the Americans were launching some insane boarding action, were in complete disarray. A head popped up from the forward hatch. Nathan, who had swum to another piece of wreckage and retrieved Smitty's forgotten .45 from his survival kit, the tail gunner had never even drawn it, fired twice. The head vanished. A scream echoed from inside the hull. Nathan reached the submarine first. The slick black steel felt alien, alive with the vibration of its idling engines. The rope ladder still hung there, forgotten in the panic. He slung his rifle, a weapon he'd never thought he'd use in this context, and climbed. The rungs were wet and treacherous. He hauled himself onto the deck, a dripping, oil-blackened phantom. A sailor, wielding a large wrench like a club, rushed him from the direction of the deck gun.
Nathan shot him from 5 feet away, the man falling backwards with a grunt. He spun, covering the open forward hatch. "Up! Now, goddammit!" he screamed down to his men. One by one, they scrambled up the ladder. Collie came last, pushing Peavy ahead of him. In less than 3 minutes, all 7 stood or crouched on the deck of the I-17. They were 7 bedraggled, terrified, but armed airmen in control of the conning tower and 1 hatch. The rest of the 60-man crew was below, trapped. "Smitty, Collie, cover that hatch," Nathan ordered, his voice finding a steadiness he didn't feel. "Anyone sticks a head out, you shoot it. Peavy, sit down there and keep pressure on that leg. The rest of you, search the deck, find anything else, tools, weapons." What followed was a tense, screaming stalemate. Shouts in Japanese came from the open hatch. Nathan leaned over, yelling down into the darkness. "We have the deck! We have explosives! Surrender or we scuttle the boat!" He had no explosives, but they didn't know that. After 5 minutes of this, a voice called up in heavily accented, fearful English. "Do not sink! Do not sink! We surrender! Send up your captain, unarmed, hands first." A slow, painful negotiation began. The Japanese captain, a Lieutenant Commander Isao Hirai, emerged, his face a mask of furious shame. Nathan, with Collie translating the basics, laid out terms. The crew would remain below, sealed in the forward torpedo room and the crew's quarters. A skeleton crew, the captain, the engineer, and a helmsman, would operate the submarine under American guns. They would set a course east toward Allied waters. And so began a 5-day odyssey of sheer nail-shredding nerve. The I-17 became a ghost ship, a vessel of surreal tension. Nathan and his men, none of whom knew a periscope from a propeller shaft, stood watch over the Japanese officers with rifles that never wavered. They learned, through mimed gestures and barks of command, the basics, how to steer, how to manage the ballast for surface running. They ran on the surface by day, charging the batteries, praying not to be spotted by a Japanese plane. At night, they dove to periscope depth, the American airmen sweating in the close, oily air, listening to the strange sounds of the submerged boat, their eyes constantly on their prisoners. Nathan's leadership was absolute, born of necessity. He slept in catnaps, his pistol in his lap, always near the control room. He rationed their meager finds of rice and fish from the sub's galley. He tended to Peavy's wound as best he could with the sub's rudimentary first aid kit. The fear was a constant companion, but it was layered with a bizarre, hyper-alert focus. They were living an impossible reality. On the 3rd day, using components from the sub's radio and parts cannibalized from their own surviving survival gear, the bombardier, a wiry man named Finney, who'd been a ham radio operator, managed to get a weak intermittent transmitter working. He sent a frantic, repeating message in clear text. "American aircrew in possession of enemy submarine I-17. Position approximate. Heading east. Request rendezvous." They didn't know if it was heard. On the morning of the 5th day, as the sun rose over a calm sea, the lookout, young Smitty, let out a hoarse cry. "Smoke! On the horizon! 2, 3 funnels!" Through the captured periscope, Nathan saw them, the sleek gray shapes of warships flying the stars and stripes, a destroyer division. He ordered the captain to surface and to run up a white flag. From the sub's stores, they found a white bedsheet. With Peavy's blood, now darkened to brown, and engine grease, they painted a crude giant USA on it. They ran it up the radio mast. The response from the USS O'Bannon was of utter, flabbergasted disbelief. A boarding party approached in a whaleboat, their weapons trained on the sub, expecting a trick. What they found were 7 emaciated, oil-stained, wild-eyed American airmen guarding 3 despondent Japanese officers at gunpoint, while the rest of the crew remained locked below. The captain of the USS O'Bannon, leaning over the bridge wing, simply stared. "What in the name of Almighty God?" he finally muttered. Nathan James, standing on the deck of his captured submarine, his borrowed Japanese naval cap perched ridiculously on his head, managed a weary salute. "Request permission to come aboard, sir, and we have a prize for the Navy." The Medal of Honor citation would read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Faced with certain capture or death, Staff Sergeant Nathan deliberately engaged the enemy vessel, drawing fire and ridicule upon himself to create distraction."
With utter disregard for his own safety, he led his men in the capture of an enemy warship, displaying tactical brilliance, indomitable leadership, and valor that reflect the highest traditions of the military service. He would receive it from President Roosevelt himself in a quiet ceremony at the White House in 1944. By then, he was back in the Pacific, flying again. He would earn the Navy Cross 6 months later, leading the defense of his crippled B-24 over Rabaul, manning a waist gun until the plane limped home. He received the Purple Heart twice for a shrapnel wound in his shoulder and a burn along his neck. But the war ended, as wars do. Nathan James went back to Kansas. He did not write a book. He did not tour on the war bond circuit. The notoriety of the submarine sergeant followed him for a time, but he shunned it. He took a job as a postal clerk in Wichita, the same job he'd left in 1941. He married Eleanor, and they had 3 children in a small, tidy house with a backyard where tulips bloomed every spring. The Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, the other ribbons, they resided in a velvet-lined case in the top drawer of his dresser. He almost never took them out. When his children, or later his grandchildren, would ask, prompted by some school report, he would shrug. The story was too big, too strange to fit into words. He'd distill it down to a single, manageable line, a piece of homespun philosophy that erased the terror, the laughter on the water, the smell of oil and fear, the 5 days of living nightmare. "Well," he'd say, a faint smile touching his lips, "I just didn't feel like drowning that day." He died in the autumn of 1995, in his own bed, with Eleanor holding his hand. He is buried in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Wichita, under a simple granite headstone that lists only his name, his dates, and the phrase, "beloved husband and father." There is no mention of the Medal of Honor, or the submarine, or the Bismarck Sea. The story, like that of Leonard Funk, tells the same essential, unsettling truth. In the crucible of an impossible moment, when logic, arithmetic, and every rule of self-preservation dictate one path, the human spirit sometimes takes another. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses. It swims the wrong way. It hears laughter and turns it into a weapon. It climbs a ladder onto an enemy deck, not because victory is likely, but because surrender is unthinkable. And in doing so, it forges legends not of supermen, but of ordinary men who, when the sea opened up and death laughed in their face, decided to do something, anything else.